surprised how few people really have put much thought into that. Others, though, will give like a knee-jerk response to it and just say, well, religion's wonderful for children all the time. And then you have other people that just say, well, you know, it should be labeled like poison under the sink, keep away from children. I think that those views a lot of times reflect people's views of religion itself and kind of get in the way of having a meaningful discussion about just how influential religion is in children's lives, as opposed to trying to satisfy maybe some other kind of agenda. The answer, of course, to the question is both. Just like any kind of institution like marriage or, you know, nationalism, I mean, you can't really just say that it's always good for folks, it's always bad for folks. I've read a lot of studies relating to religious faith, teachings of children, teachings of parents, what goes on in cults, what goes on in mainstream religious communities. And I'll be getting into a little bit later, how do we determine whether a religious influence, religious teachings, or a religious community is beneficial for children and when it's not. Some studies show that children raised in religious households have better self-control, that they learn better and don't get into as much trouble as compared to kids who were raised in secular households. I've interviewed many survivors of abuse who say that when they were young, religious faith helped them psychologically to survive the abuse. And someone mentioned earlier the boy who was begging God to kill his brother who was being physically abusive. And I've interviewed people who, as children, just got through a very difficult situation and found comfort in their religious beliefs. Victor Vieth, who is a former prosecutor and a forensics expert, in interviewing children after crimes have been committed, writes in an article that it's likely that spirituality is an intrinsic part of human development and may be particularly important to vulnerable children. But religion also has a dark side, and while we're here to talk mainly about cultic groups, it's critical that we talk about child rearing and child maltreatment in cults. Most experts discuss how cults affect adults. Many people who are first finding themselves in a cult do so at the age of 18, 19. They're a young adult at that point, and it's a very different experience when it's an individual who is recruited as an adult into a cult versus someone who has been raised in it since birth. And I feel like sometimes we're not hearing enough information about just how cult experiences affect children. Some of the things that I'll be talking about here, I learned from reading Margaret Singer's book, Cults in Our Midst, where she devotes a chapter to how cults affect children. Another reason why we should be talking about children in cults is that some groups, while some groups are not necessarily geared to affecting children and child rearing in a certain way, where they're almost keeping children more at bay because they see them as a distraction. Heaven's Gate, Scientology, groups like that, they were forcing people to get abortions, and they were just seeing kids as getting in the way of the indoctrination of the adults. But in most cases that I've seen, cults are seeing children as being necessary components to the future of the organization. And so therefore they have a very well-oiled machine to work children into the fray, indoctrinating parents to raise their kids a certain way. They'll be controlling the family even before it's a family. They'll be telling parents whom to marry. They'll be telling parents when they should procreate, how many kids they should have, and that kind of thing. And then, of course, after the kids are born, they're telling the parents just how they should raise them. And so the whole idea there is to cultivate an environment of compliance so that there's more control that the cult leadership has over the environment. But as you'll notice if you do read Breaking Their Will, I don't discuss cults all that much. I don't refer to religious organizations as cults all that much. And the reason why is because I feel like it might sideline some of these issues. Many of the cases that I've studied involve children who were raised in organizations that the general public probably would not consider to be a cult. Certainly they would not fulfill the requirements that some called experts do. For example, there may not be a living central figure who the members are worshiping. I look at all religious communities, all religious households, all religious organizations that I consider to be authoritarian. And that to me is more telling as to whether or not children are at risk for religious maltreatment. Certainly cults are the most authoritarian, one could say the most totalitarian run governed organizations, and there you are going to see the worst problems. But I think it's very important to understand how many larger organizations, ones who have been around a very, very long time, who have cultic aspects to them, are also harmful to children, if not in as an extreme way. Some examples I would give would be conservative Amish communities, ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, some evangelical Christian communities, some conservative Islamic immigrant communities, where we're seeing lots of problems relating to child maltreatment that is not caused by so much, say mental illness or poverty or some of those other risk factors, but aspects of the belief system. And the final thing I want to say as to why it's important to look at some of these broader, more encompassing religious organizations in addition to cults is that, when you're talking about abuses in cults, and there's an article in the paper about it, I would say it's pretty common for Americans who are not familiar with that cult, to immediately get it, that what's going on in there is not okay. But when you're looking at religious child maltreatment in an organization where it's not a cult, where it's something maybe that, the Amish, for example, people have been hearing about the Amish, their whole lives perhaps, they're a lot more resistant to recognizing abuse as abuse and neglect as neglect. And in fact, they will, they meaning, the general public who are outside of those organizations, will speak out in support of perpetrators. So, yes, in addition to the positives, a religious upbringing also has a dark side. There was a study that came out this year that shows that 5- and 6-year-old children who are exposed to religious ideas find it more difficult to differentiate between fantasy and reality than kids who are raised in religious households. And I think we also have to question some of the studies that have shown religious influences to be beneficial to children. Not that those results aren't accurate, but they're looking at things like behavior, how well behaved they are, how controlled they are with their behavior, do they get into trouble as much, and things like that. I would like to see a study that looks at the influences of religion relating to children's happiness and state of well-being and self-esteem. And sadly, of course, problems related to religious belief can be much more serious and even fatal. And we'll get into some of those examples later. And I would like to just say that if there are individuals where there's any kind of triggering going on, I hope that you will know that, and anything you need to do, whether it's just leave the room or ask me a question and interrupt, whatever you need to do, of course, is fine by me. Marcy Hamilton, who's a professor at Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University, wrote a book called God versus the Gavel, and she devotes a chapter to how religion is infused in law that affects kids. And she writes, horrible things have been done to children beneath the cloak of religion. Children have been raped, beaten, and permitted to die excruciating deaths. So, what is religious child maltreatment? It's child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators, victims, or the surrounding community. And I think as we go through some examples and learn a little bit more about the aspects of religious child maltreatment, you'll certainly see that these things manifest themselves in cults to a pretty severe level. And I think I'll add that, you know, when we're talking about what is abuse and neglect, I personally don't just go by what the law says, because unfortunately there are a number of religious exemptions in child abuse and neglect statutes, which I personally don't agree with. I think that all children should be protected equally regardless of the religiosity of their caregivers. So for example, there are many states that do not consider medical neglect to be medical neglect when they're looking at criminal law if the perpetrators, I call them perpetrators, who allow children to die of medical neglect since their beliefs oppose medical care and they believe so strongly in faith healing that the children suffer greatly, have long-term disabilities, and sometimes even die. In many states, those parents are not prosecuted, and they don't ever see a courtroom. There are many advocates trying to change that and get rid of those religious exemptions, and I'm certainly one of them. What can we say about perpetrators of religious child maltreatment? Not all of these characteristics are true for every perpetrator, but you'll see combinations from this list. They claim to possess the one true faith and consider those who maintain different beliefs to be misguided, depraved, or evil. Perpetrators are members of a religious culture that is governed in an authoritarian manner. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. They are motivated to mistreat children based on their interpretations of faith doctrines and scripture, or their desires to follow the norms of a faith culture. Perpetrators of religious child maltreatment rarely show remorse for their actions and instead justify them with scripture or doctrine. They do not possess a conventional understanding of what abuse and neglect is, and or believe their actions are spiritually and they believe very often that their actions are spiritually beneficial to their victims. And they are willing to break laws that criminalize child abuse and neglect, believing that they are acting according to a higher law. What children are at the greatest risk for religious child maltreatment? A lot of people ask me, well, which religion is worse? Or which cult is worse? I don't think it really matters what brand of religion a family subscribes to or a community is part of. I don't think it matters necessarily whether a family is reading from the Book of Mormon or the New Testament or the Quran, or whether they call a deity God or Allah, Jehovah, or Yahweh. I tend to take a sociological approach to this, and after just reading many criminal cases and studies and interviewing many perpetrators and survivors, that I look at the community or the environment that a child is being raised in, and specifically how the adults who are the caretakers of that child are being governed by the religious leadership. And my determination is that if a child is being raised in a religious authoritarian culture, whether it's a community or an organization or a household, that they're going to be at more risk for this type of abuse and neglect. What makes up a religious authoritarian culture are three characteristics. There's a strict social hierarchy. So you'll have the religious leadership being the most powerful of everyone else in the culture. men are almost always more powerful than women, and children usually hold no rights whatsoever. The membership is unusually fearful, and this is due usually to indoctrination, being raised in a culture where they're taught to fear outsiders, to consider anyone who's a non-believer as being in some way evil or out to get them, and that kind of thing. And then, of course, you will have fear-based doctrines that have to do with great suffering in the afterlife. Also, you will have rules, many rules, that determine how people are treated if they are not compliant. So you'll sort of have these fear tactics going on that affect children, affect adults in their lives on Earth, and then also worrying about what might happen to them later if they're not going to comply with the rules. And finally, the culture is socially separatist. While we're familiar with a number of groups who have set themselves up in very remote parts of the country, we'll certainly see social separatism in urban and suburban environments. Here are some examples of religious child maltreatment. I'm sorry, I need to hold off on what I was just about to go into. I just added a couple of slides that I thought would be helpful to just paint the picture a little bit more about religious authoritarianism. And I consider what happened to the People's Temple to be in 1978, where nearly a third of the more than 900 people who died, they were minors. I consider that to be the most egregious case of religious child maltreatment affecting Americans. I say that not just because so many were killed, but because leading up to that day, for years, children were being horribly abused in a very systematic way. To my knowledge, Jim Jones did not actually have contact with the kids in terms of directly abusing them. I could very well be wrong about that. But my understanding is that he orchestrated all of the abuse to go on. So they were hanging children upside down in wells and telling them monsters lived down there. You had a woman who carried around a great big piece of wood called the Board of Education, and she was the one that would be paddling these children. And so I feel like while many people are aware of what happened on the day of the mass suicide/murders, there's really not enough understanding of just how the children suffered in that group. And it is, it was one of the most totalitarian run organizations, I think we can agree. The way that religious authoritarianism impacts children is because it divides family members from family members. It breaks down the parent-child bond. And Jim Jones was a master of that. So he had children calling him dad. He had children reporting on their parents and that kind of thing. So he could wedge himself, between the children and those adults that they should have been able to look to for protection. This idea of using a religious doctrine or someone's power to weaken family bonds is something that goes back to the New Testament. Now, I'm not making any statement about Jesus when I say this, and who knows if he actually did make this statement. But I think that this Matthew 10, where he says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." To me, that is not a pro-family stance. And so I think that this reflects some of the religious authoritarianism that was going on back in biblical times. So this couple is Herbert and Catherine Scheibel of Pennsylvania. Earlier this year, they were sentenced to up to 7 years in prison for allowing their 8-month-old child, Brandon, to die of pneumonia. The The Scheibels belong to a Pentecostal Christian church that believes in faith healing over medical care. So when Brandon got sick, they refused to take him to a doctor and instead treated him with prayer. Remarkably, Brandon was not the first in the family to die of religious medical neglect. In 2009, their son Kent died at the age of 2, also from untreated pneumonia. And someone here could probably tell me what their church was, and I'm blanking on the name of their religious organization. If anyone knows.
The South Church of the First Century or something.
The Firstborn, I think it is. Yeah, thank you, Church of the Firstborn. Many conservative faith communities oppose immunizing children, which has led to outbreaks of disease, particularly measles. Failing to immunize children not only leaves them vulnerable to disease, but the wider community as well. In 2013, no deaths from measles were reported, but 58 members of a Jewish community in Brooklyn, New York, contracted measles. Also that year, 21 cases of measles were reported, stemming from a large church community in Texas. This year, a measles outbreak in Ohio spread from a group of Amish missionaries, reached 68 cases, the most number of measles cases reported in the U.S. since 1996. In May of this year, a mother and father from Wisconsin were sentenced to 18 months of probation for physically abusing their children. The couple was the last of a handful of parents who belonged to the Aletheia Bible Church to be found guilty of harming their children through excessive corporal punishment. The church was led by this man, Philip Caminiti, who was sentenced to 2 years in prison for conspiracy to commit child abuse after he instructed parents in the group to punish, quote, selfish children as young as infants and toddlers by striking them on the bare buttocks with wooden dowels, based on his interpretation of Proverbs, which tells parents to use, quote, the rod to discipline children. There are many different interpretations of the term the rod, but like many conservative religious folks, Philip Caminiti took that to mean literally you should be using a wooden instrument to beat children when they are even slightly out of line. You may not be aware of the Jewish ritual known as Mitzvah B'Peh, which is practiced in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. In this ritual, which takes place after circumcision, the moil puts his mouth on the penis and sucks blood from the wound. This ritual was started hundreds of years ago as a way to believed to sanitize the wound. However, some rabbis have given herpes simplex 1 to babies. It's a disease that the vast majority of Americans have. And when infants, newborns, come in contact with it, they can suffer brain damage and even death because their bodies just can't fight the virus. Since 2000, 16 babies in New York City have contracted herpes after undergoing Mitzvah B'Peh, and of these, 2 babies died and 2 were brain damaged. Finally, just to talk about some of the psychological issues, oftentimes these don't make the news as some of the other more egregious cases, but I'm convinced that emotional and psychological abuse and neglect is the most common form of religious child maltreatment and exists in just about every case that could happen. In my book, I talk about 4 forms of emotional abuse. One is spurning, one is terrorizing, another is isolating and exploiting. And all 4 of these, I think, manifest themselves in a religious setting in ways that you could probably imagine. Recently, I saw a comment that a woman named Amber made to one of my blog posts, and she wrote, "A familiar statement I often heard in my youth was, 'You better have your heart right with the Lord. You never know when Jesus is coming back.' That statement scared the out of me. How do you know if your heart is right with the Lord? If I can't communicate with Him or see Him, how do I know if I was all good? I don't believe a young mind can truly comprehend faith. I don't know if I understand it now. Either way, the statement created a sense of inadequacy, confusion, but ultimately fear. I felt as though every person I loved was saved but me, so I tried very hard to please God." Now, that probably, what she's written, probably includes terrorizing, but more than anything, I think it includes exploiting. And exploiting, if you understand how how exploiting is harmful to children. You know, if you think about someone who's trying to live their life through their child, you know, they weren't a great tennis player as a kid, so now they're going to make sure this kid's great at tennis, and they're making sure, you know, the kid's taking lessons every day, playing in tournaments every day, and that's an example of exploiting. Well, I mean, I think it's hard to recognize that when it happens in a religious context, but very often you'll see parents or adult caretakers essentially living their faith through children. There are many risk factors associated with child maltreatment. Mental illness, poverty are two big ones. I believe that religious and other ideological beliefs should be added to this list. And perhaps to us, it doesn't seem like this would be a really difficult concept to grasp. You would think that it wouldn't be hard to convince people that sometimes religious belief is not healthy for kids, or at least the way that their religious doctrines are interpreted by adults. In fact, if you look at statistics, people seem to be getting less and less religious all the time in the United States, and certainly in some other countries. For example, nearly 20% of Americans say they don't affiliate themselves with any religion. Many experts, including people of faith, are trying to bring awareness to this issue of religious child maltreatment. For example, Princeton Theological Seminary professor Donald Capps writes in his book, The Child Song, this, meaning child abuse committed in the name of faith, is not a pleasant subject, especially for those of us who have deep personal attachments to the Christian faith. But we dare not avoid the subject, for the abuse of children in the name of religion may well be the most significant reason for why they leave the faith when they are old enough to do so. We must ask ourselves, who can blame them? Why should they not abandon the scene of their silent torment? Now, Dr. Capps is a pretty liberal Christian, but this December, when my nonprofit organization has our conference, one of our keynote speakers is Boz Trevithian. And Boz is the grandson of the Reverend Billy Graham. He's an evangelical Christian and teaches law at Liberty University. And he started an organization called GRACE, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, where his organization investigates abuse in churches. And he writes in this article, the heartbreaking reality is that the marginalization of survivors is all too common in the Christian community. Just like the priest and Levi in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we're often so quick to embrace rational excuses for why we walk away. When we do this, we marginalize the very lives that God sees as beautiful and infinitely valuable. And usually I give like a whole long list of different examples of religious child maltreatment. I'm not doing that today because I've already given you enough examples to not brighten your day. But one of them, a form of neglect, would be failing to report sexual abuse of a child because you're trying to protect the reputation of a faith community or a faith leader. Other reasons why we should think that this wouldn't be such a difficult to grasp issue have to do with court decisions. In 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that the right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community or the child to ill health or death. Parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow that they are free to make martyrs of their children before they've reached the age of full and legal discretion when they can make that choice for themselves. So that was the Supreme Court ruling in Prince v. Massachusetts in 1944. And then in 1989, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's a comprehensive document that promises to give minors a full range of human rights. The treaty contains 54 articles that adhere to 4 core principles: non-discrimination, the best interests of the child, the right to life, survival, and development, and considering the views of the child in decisions which affect them, according to age and maturity. Countries that sign and ratify the treaty commit to protecting and ensuring children's rights. While there's no penalty for countries that fail to meet the prescribed goals, they are monitored by an independent body of experts who review their reports and make recommendations. In 1995, while Bill Clinton was in office as president, the United States signed the convention with the intention that Congress would ratify the treaty at a later date. It's not what happened, and I'll be talking about why that is a little bit later. And I pulled out a few excerpts from the treaty which speak to some of the things that we've been hearing about. The child shall have the right to freedom of expression. It speaks to the right of the child to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And nations shall protect the child against all forms of exploitation. But even with experts talking about this issue, with so many high-profile cases making headlines in courts, sometimes ruling in favor of children's rights, many people of faith fail to accept the dichotomy of religious belief, that it can not only lead adults to nurture children, but also to harm them. Many people question the actual role that religion plays in these cases. Some say that perpetrators are just simply mentally ill or sadistic, or they're not really religious because they're not interpreting doctrine or scripture correctly. I take issue with these apologists. For one, mental illness sometimes comes into play, but it's in the minority of cases. Of all the criminal cases I've looked at, very few, the defendants were found to be incompetent to stand trial, and in very few were they found guilty or innocent because of insanity. I have seen cases where someone's mental illness will make them more vulnerable to religious ideas. One case is that of Andrea Yates. She was the Houston housewife who drowned all 5 of her young children because she thought that would save them from going to hell. And she was suffering from bipolar disorder that was not being treated. She was also exposed to a radical preacher who did a good job of making her feel very guilty as a mother. And then I guess this idea that, well, you know, these people are really not acting in a religious way. I take issue with that as well. I don't think anyone has a monopoly to determine what makes a true Christian, what makes a devout Muslim, or what makes a real Jew. I feel like people get to decide how they're going to interpret doctrines for themselves. My only issue is when children are involved, you need to take a little bit more time in making those decisions. So what we have here is, I think, a problem of denial, and Marcy Hamilton again does talk about that in her book. The United States has a romantic attitude toward religious individuals, as though they're always doing what is right. The unrealistic belief that religion is always for the good is a hazardous myth. I want to talk about 2 other responses that religious apologists might make when they're hearing about these kinds of issues. This will be true even after, a court has convicted a perpetrator of harming a child based on his or her religious convictions. They do believe that very often that what they're doing is spiritually beneficial to the children. And I think that when you have that kind of a belief and that kind of lack of empathy going on, there's really no protection for the child at all, because they're justifying it in their own mind as doing, following their parental duty, their duty to God, their duty to their religious organization. The other big one that I think is especially worrisome is the idea that we must defend our religious freedoms at all costs. According to these folks, our religious liberties are slipping through our fingers, and we really need to do anything and all that we can to hold on to them, and that includes following along with child grooming practices, even though they're illegal. And we've seen decisions made by courts and legislatures, as well as public comments by officials, that back up this kind of idea and put children's lives in peril. When that happens, I feel we're setting up an uneven playing field, where certain children who are raised by certain pious individuals are denied the same rights enjoyed by all other children. Here's some examples of how this is played out in the courts. I should say that sometimes courts will decide in favor of the children. One example would be when Jehovah's Witness parents will deny their child a life-saving blood transfusion, more often than not, courts have come to bat for the kid and said, we take custody of the child, they're going to get their blood transfusion. Give me an idea on time. I'm not sure what time I started. Can you give me an idea how much more time I have left?
You have like 30 minutes if you want.
Thank you. Okay, so, but here's some examples of where it went the other way. In 1972, the Supreme Court decided that the Amish could take their children out of school at the age of 14, even though the state of Wisconsin, where the case was filed, made education mandatory up to the age of 16. The court made this decision after hearing lawyers for the Amish argue that, quote, salvation requires life in a church community separate and apart from the world and worldly influence. There was a dissenting voice on that court, and I write about this in the book because he was really prophetic in what he said. He was talking about how children who grow up and decide they don't want to be Amish, and then they are either cast out or they leave the clan behind, are at that point left with huge difficulties in trying to gain a livelihood, gain some independence. I've interviewed people who grew up Amish who, when they got out of it, they didn't even know how to order water in a restaurant. So you can see that if they haven't had a high school education, they really are going to be in trouble. But generally speaking, when religious organizations are pushing for certain child rearing practices, they're not really so concerned about the well-being of the people that leave. They are only wanting to strengthen the organization and maintain compliance among those who remain. Back to Mississippi-Pet, I've talked about how we've now had 16 confirmed cases of kids just in New York City, babies who have contracted herpes through Mississippi-Pet. Even after that's been discovered, this practice is still legal in every state. It is perfectly legal for a grown man who's just circumcised a newborn child to put his mouth on the penis. And even though I think most of us would consider that to be, in some cases, sexual abuse. Clearly, when you're talking about putting a child's life at risk, that this is a really worrisome practice. Yet, the only thing that's happened in response to this is that New York City Health Department has required Moyles to get the approval of parents before they do it. In many cases, I'll just do it, not even ask the parents. I forgot to talk about one aspect of Margaret Sanger's work where she talks about parents being middle managers. And I think in this kind of situation, parents who are so powerless in these ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities that they don't even know, whether or not a Moyle is going to carry out this practice or not says a lot about how they're middle managers. Yeah?
Does the court require these guys to get blood tests, just to make sure they're safe to put there?
Nope. Moyles usually do this just in the privacy of a home or the back room of a synagogue, and don't have medical training. So it's really just given one big pass because it's considered an important religious ritual to the Jewish population. I will say that there are many Jews now that are speaking out against male circumcision and are conducting a ritual that's called Bris Shalom. And this involves all the same ritualistic practices, but without the cutting. So it's still welcoming the child into the faith, but doing so without removal of the foreskin. I've talked a little bit about religious exemptions regarding medical neglect. Most states have these exemptions that allow parents whose children die from religious medical neglect to avoid prosecution. This is a gravestone in Idaho, a state in which a large faith healing group called the Followers of Christ operates. The group has graveyards full of dead children in Idaho and other states, children who have died from medically treatable illnesses, had they been given that. And yet, many parents have never seen a courtroom. This fight is now going on in Idaho, which is seen by child advocates as having some of the loosest regulations when it comes to protecting children from faith healing type of crimes. And you will hear legislators who are interviewed about this bill that's been raised in the last year, saying something very similar to what the Amish said about why they should be able to take their kids out of high school. I saw one interview with a woman who was a lawmaker just saying, okay, here's the thing, these people believe that they will go to hell if they take their kids to a doctor. That was her justification for keeping the religious exemption in place. So essentially she's saying that we can't mess with their religious belief system. It'll cause intense anxiety on the part of the parents without seemingly any regard for the rights of the children who are suffering and in some cases dying. A similar extreme comment was made by a public official in 1990 in Florida. At the time, a religious group called End Times Ministry was wanting to move into Lake City, Florida, and the members of this group, End Times Ministry, were zealous believers of faith healing. And when people in the town learned that a baby in the group had died from an untreated nosebleed, they were very resistant to welcoming them in. The mayor of Lake City, T. Gerald Witt, was so incensed that his constituents would not warmly welcome the group. He told the St. Petersburg Times, "It's maybe necessary for some babies to die to maintain our religious freedoms. It may be the price we have to pay. Everything has a price." And finally, you remember I told you about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that was signed under Bill Clinton's watch. It seemed to be on its way to ratification at that time. After all, the United States was instrumental in drawing up the document. Under the Reagan administration, officials borrowed concepts from the U.S. Constitution to be included in the convention. But while now every United Nations country with a functioning government has ratified this treaty, the U.S. never did. And the reason why was largely because conservative groups, who oftentimes also happen to be religious conservatives, one of them being President George W. Bush, opposed it. Opponents stated that ratifying the convention would jeopardize American sovereignty and parental rights, and one of the biggest concerns they raised was that it would lead to a ban on spanking children. And some of the studies that I talk about in my book regarding spanking shows that conservative Christians are the most reliant on corporal punishment as a disciplinary tool than other religious groups. I think that those studies needed to be done in a more comprehensive way, because my findings show that really, any orthodox / fundamentalist / ultra-conservative religious organization, you're going to have that same reliance on authoritarian parenting and spanking. But it's certainly true in the conservative branches of the Christian church. And the reason why they thought that this might lead to a ban on spanking was because there were provisions in the convention that speak to a need for school discipline to be, quote, administered in a manner consistent with the child's human dignity, and a call for children to be protected from, quote, all forms of physical or mental violence. Today, President Obama has called the United States failure to ratify the treaty an embarrassment, but he's not taken any measures to get Congress to adopt it. So, given all this resistance, given all this resistance to protecting children from religious child maltreatment, what can we do to stop it? My book, Breaking Their Will, does list some solutions that relate to changing legislation and public policy. For example, I believe that we should get rid of all religious exemptions in child abuse statutes. I think that all children should be protected in the same way. If we feel like education is important enough that it should be mandatory up to a certain grade level of almost all American children, then that should extend to all American children. I do also think that clergy should be required to report abuse in states where adults are mandatory reporters. So, for example, you have states where clergy are required to report, but there is a loophole that allows them not to if they hear about a suspected case of abuse in confession. You have some states that make all adults mandatory reporters, and I don't think that clergy should be exempted. But I do believe that the most effective change is actually going to come from within the faith communities themselves, with a little help from child advocates who can nudge them along. Before I get into that, though, I'm going to quickly just give you a little history on a culture that made a very positive change for children in a fairly short amount of time. The Chinese custom of binding girls' feet began in the 10th century. It was considered to be a sign of beauty, elegance, and socioeconomic status for women to have had their feet bound as children. It was initially practiced by the wealthy, but eventually became a status symbol for the middle classes as well. So it was commonly practiced. Foot binding involved breaking the bones of the foot of a very young girl and binding it for a long period of time, so that when the binding was removed, the average length of the foot never exceeded 4 inches. It was extremely painful, permanently crippling, and often led to long-term health problems. Fortunately, the practice did come to an end, and rather quickly. Here's how it happened. In the late 1880s, some Christian missionaries in England met with women in China who agreed to become advocates against foot binding and vowed that they would not bind their daughters' feet. Eventually, more women joined what was called the Quit Foot Binding Society. So these advocates, who were outsiders, immediately chose to start working with individuals who were from the culture. The campaigners also collaborated with prominent Chinese scholars who also vowed to oppose the practice. The campaigners were respectful of Chinese culture. They dressed the part, they learned their language, they got men, prominent members of society to state publicly that they, they ended up having the movement go along to the point where it became kind of uncool to bind one's feet. Men started to say that they would only marry women who had unbound feet. And so pretty soon foot binding was not only losing status, it was considered shameful. Only one generation after the advocates began their work, the practice died out, and the Chinese Republic banned foot binding in 1911. Other efforts to try to end culturally harmful practices have not been very successful. One example might be trying to end the practice of female genital cutting. What has happened in those instances oftentimes is there's some sort of word on high where the governmental leadership will just try to ban something outright. And in some cultures in Africa, they've rebelled against that to the point of just cutting, all the girls they could find. Today, it's illegal in the U.S. and in the UK, and yet there are hundreds of thousands of girls who are at risk for this, being taken out of the country, back to their homeland. So just making something illegal hasn't been shown to be very effective. So what I propose, and why I started my nonprofit organization, is to try to work with faith communities, educate them more about religious child maltreatment, as well as even just questioning their teachings of children, their teachings of parents, questioning the role that they should have in terms of advising parents on how to parent, questioning what kind of training they have, questioning if their curriculum has been vetted by child psychologists, say. And so we're not just talking about getting folks to stop abusing or neglecting children in the name of faith, but also to take it a little bit farther and to look at children as important people, to understand child development better, and just to, in general, respect children as individuals. So as we're continuing to meet with faith communities, we've started a designation program. Just very quickly, those that go through our training will then be designated as a child-friendly faith community. And we hope that this will kind of start a movement similar to the Anti-Foot Binding Society, where it'll be more of the norm to become a child-friendly faith community, and those that are not, hopefully might be shamed into becoming one. We're going to skip through a few slides. And sorry about this blue type, but that's been the case throughout. This is my nonprofit organization. It's called the Child Friendly Faith Project. And you can learn about it by going to childfriendlyfaith.org. So these are some of the questions that we hope that parents and clergy and other congregants will start asking themselves. How knowledgeable are we about child abuse and neglect? Where do we draw the line between religious rights and children's rights? Are there parenting choices that are legal but make us uncomfortable? What role should places of worship assume in teaching parents about raising children? Does the way we teach children our faith enhance child development? Do congregants feel comfortable reporting suspected abuse or neglect to outside authorities? Let's sit through maybe one more here. These are some of the benefits that I think that faith communities will see. And if you're wondering why would a faith community even, be bothered with this, similar to how churches have call themselves open and affirming to welcome LGBT members, similar to how churches have carried the label eco-friendly and that sort of thing. They see this as a way to grow their congregation. I run a Facebook group of 580 people plus, and there are a lot of people in that group who are parents, they're people of faith, and they're looking for a religious organization or a place of worship where they can become members and feel confident that that organization understands children's needs. Not just says, all children are precious, gifts of God, and that kind of thing, but really understands children's physical and emotional needs and understands about religious child maltreatment. So this is something that if they market themselves and will help them with that, they can hopefully then attract people who care about these issues, and will grow the child-friendly faith organizations, and then the ones that are not so child-friendly, the more authoritarian ones, hopefully will just shrink into oblivion. Ultimately, we hope that churches, synagogues, and mosques will perceive children in a more positive light and better attend to their physical and emotional needs. Thank you very much. I don't know how much time we have, but of course I'd be happy to take questions.
Hey, Jan, I just wonder, have you ever seen what you were talking about, Jonestown, the book by Kenneth Wooden, The Children of Jonestown? Yeah, I remember when I first read that. It was unbelievable.
Yeah. I haven't seen actually anyone else talk about the abuses in that cult except for Ken, and
yeah.
I really appreciate that book. He's talking about this amazing book written by Ken Wooden called The Children of Jonestown, and he just explains just the only person really that's talked about the kids other than the fact that they were murdered.
Dr. Bruce Perry at Texas, the Waco Children, did you have any interaction with the studies that he did?
A little bit. I haven't seen a lot that overlaps with my research necessarily. He's a pretty hard person to connect with.
Yeah.
I've tried to, because I thought it would be great to have him, speak at our conferences and things like that. But I haven't really gotten to know his work in a lot of detail, but what I did see, I wasn't resonating exactly with what I would. But why don't you talk a little bit about what his studies have shown?
Well, years ago, he spoke at the Cult Awareness Network's conference. Were you
Yeah.
there? We heard him speak in person, and he really documented that the abuse was pretty bad in there. It was all based on first-hand testimony, and he used a lot of...
You're talking about the Branch Davidians?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things he showed, which I thought was really interesting, I was with him in Texas around the FLDS thing, but
Yeah.
his you know, they got the children who didn't die, and they were able to study them for a period of time. And they said one of the things was, I mean, they only referred to Koresh's dad. All their pictures were Koresh's dad, all of that. But he said those kids, little kids, had the heart rate of like a, you know, 55-year-old stressed out executive. I mean, they just had this incredible heart rates in normal sitting mode because they were so traumatized by their experiences in that compound.
I think that work was really important because there was so much publicity, you know, against the government for, you know, doing what they did, that the abuses that went on in the cult, similar to the FLDS, you know, when I wrote this really long feature story on the FLDS being raided by CPS, you know, and the Texas Rangers, this is in West Texas, where CPS ended up removing hundreds of children from the compound because of fears they had that girls were being spiritually married to older men, which they were. There was such a backlash against CPS for, you know, disrupting families and that kind of thing. And you know, they certainly, just like Janet Reno, I mean, they didn't do it all very well. But through all of that negative publicity, and what was lost was just how much abuse was going on in that cult.